All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May 29th, 2024. I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. And let's start off with a moment of silence. Remember our fallen brothers and sisters, as well as our military across our great country. All right, thank you. Well, welcome. Happy May. We got May weather out there. Yeah. Good job, Tor. All right, in front of us, we have a good agenda lined up. Thank you to the staff and team. They do great work. Start off with our number one, which is our approval of the April 22. Wow. No donut, but 2 cups of coffee. Way to go. Senator Holy.
It's the bear claw.
Yeah, I know it's the bear claw. Motion's been made and seconded to adopt the minutes. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Right, minutes are adopted. Item number 2 on our list is the contribution rate setting overview, which is, I believe Jacob's going to do it. Steve, by a little background.
So this is a rate setting year for the board. And as a reminder, 2 years ago, the rates were set in statute. So the rates didn't require adoption back then. So it's been a while since the board has gone through the normal rate adoption, rate setting cycle. Jacob's here to give you an overview of what that is going to look like for you this interim. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jacob.
Okay, thank you. For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. So issue in front of the board today is that the board may adopt contribution rates for the 25 to 27 and 27 through 29 biennia. There's no board action required today. This is really just a primer for the much more detailed and exciting actuarial presentation that the actuaries will be providing in an upcoming meeting. Although I should say I did give them a chance to review this. I always get a little nervous speaking actuary, knowing that they're listening and that I'll get some of the terminology a little off and make them uncomfortable. But okay, so rate setting process. So OSA performs actuarial valuations for the board in odd numbered years. The valuation estimates future benefits to be paid from the plan and gives us the funded status of the plan. It also includes assumptions regarding investment returns, demographic changes, and one that's been more interesting of late, inflation. The results from the valuation help the board determine contribution rates for the upcoming biennia, and are used to calculate the contribution rates that fund the expected future benefits of the plan. OSA will present the contribution rates to the board at the June meeting. So the rates adopted by the board in 2022 were based on the 2019 actuarial valuation. And that was for the 21 through 23 and the 23 through 25 biennia. Have the rates up there on the screen for everyone, for the member, the employer, and the state. Also, that included language to reassess the contribution rates in the 25-27 for the 25-27 biennia, which is the standard practice of the board. So the board's standard practice is adopt that 4-year rate and then reassess every 2 years. So the board funding policies, left two funding policies. The board sets policies to assist meeting the funding goal of stable contribution rates, and while also fully funding the plan. To meet this goal, there's what I just mentioned, the 4-year rate adoption, where the board adopts for the 4 years and then reassesses every 2. And then there's also the minimum rate funding policy. And this is something the board has focused on a lot over recent years. And I'll get into more detail about that because it came into play with the benefit enhancement legislation and was a big part of the board's work on that and the eventual law that was passed. But before that, the minimum rate funding policy, the goal there is to have relatively stable rates that don't fluctuate with changes in assets. I know when the board talks about that, you often reference a goal of it being more like a mortgage where members and employers can have an expectation of what their contribution rate is going to be. Now, it's never quite as stable as a mortgage rate where it is just set in stone typically, but it goal to keep it as to fluctuate as little as possible. So the board adopted a minimum rate policy of 90% or 100% of the normal cost based on the plan funded status. And that this you don't often think about this because the board usually ends up adopting the minimum rate funding policy, but it's called the minimum rate funding policy because that's what it is. It applies if the minimum rate is higher than the aggregate rate. So the actuaries are always also calculating the aggregate rate. And then the higher of those two is what the policy is to adopt. So I'm going to go into more detail here on the benefit enhancement legislation and changes that made to the minimum rate policy. So as Steve mentioned in the introduction, it froze the rates through the 23-25 biennium. And so this will be the first rate setting where those have been unfrozen. And it created an offset rate that applied to the 90 and 100% minimum rate tiers. And that offset rate, just a reminder, this was something we discussed in developing the benefit enhancement legislation, that there was going to be that the minimum rate, the existing minimum rate funding policy did not account for the influx of cash coming to the plan from the benefit improvement account. So that benefit improvement account money had been placed into there, and the minimum rate policy of the board would not have accounted for those assets moving over. And so to account for those, the board decided to go with this offset rate that would be calculated by the actuaries. Me and Steve actually recently had a meeting with them. They're working on that, and so that will be presented to the board by the actuaries. Their work on that. Okay, so in addition to that, the legislation put the board's minimum rate funding policy into law. Before it was just a policy of the board. Now that policy is in law. And then the legislature also added this part to the bill. It was not included in the initial legislation, which was to create another step down in the minimum rate policy. So if the funding status of the plan was at least 110%, then the rate would drop down from 90% to 80% of the entry age normal cost. I did want to add that with that, the legislature did not include an offset rate to be included, just to be aware of. Okay, so next steps, OSA will present the results of their actuarial valuation in June. They are currently working with Milliman, an outside actuarial firm, which the board has used in recent years to audit the results of that valuation. Milliman will present the results of that in July to the board, and then the board will have the option of adopting contribution rates in that July meeting. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. And we do have actuaries, I think, on the call as well to help out.
Questions? Anybody online? All right. Well, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
All right. Item number 3, Steve, is the 2024 interim adoption. Looks like Jacob's going to do that as well.
Yeah, So you've got a preview of the draft interim work plan at your last meeting. And then based on some of the feedback from that meeting and from correspondence that the board received, we kind of came up with the updated draft, the final draft, if you will, for today. The plan is Jacob will go through these topics, and then there'll be points within his presentation to make motions on how you choose to move forward. You won't be waiting until the very end and then trying to go back too far and pick things up. There's plenty of time on this. And from our perspective, I'm just saying the more clarity we get from you guys today, the easier it is, the more productive we can be during the interim. So please don't be shy about asking questions or having discussion. It was intended that this would take up the bulk of today's meetings. You've got all the time that you need. And with that, Jacob, I'll let you get to it.
Okay, once again, Jacob White, staff to the board. So the board must adopt an interim work plan for the 2024 interim. We've broken out the work plan into three sections, and each will require a motion to adopt. We're going to start with that's changed a little bit. Like Steve said, we're going to go through each of the policy topics one by one, but I'm going to start off with the actuarial and administrative topics, and then give you the option to pass a motion on those all together before we get on to the individual policy topics. So the actuarial topics, no changes from what you've seen in the previous presentations, other than just finished item 3 of that one. So administrative topics, there's only one change. We moved the board salary setting authority that was in the bill that was the left to endorse bill that was passed this session. We've moved that from the administrative topics into the policy topics, since there's going to need to be more presentations on that and some policy decisions made by the board. Otherwise, I don't think there's any other changes to this or anything out of the ordinary. Any questions on either of those, on the actuarial or administrative topics?
I know we have, Karen, maybe you can help me out on the director evaluation portion of it. Do we have dates on that? I apologize.
The end of year.
Okay.
Keep it kind of calendar related. We did discuss potential of going to a fiscal year evaluation cycle, so that is up to the board, but we do have the beginning of that in place. The admin committees kind of set the parameters up. So he knows what he's being evaluated against. We just don't have the official dates yet.
Okay. Thank you. Questions? Right. So then we have board action, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So if the board would like to make a motion to adopt the actuarial and administrative topics for the interim work plan.
Motion is made and seconded to adopt the actual and administrative topics as presented. Discussion? Seeing none, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Right.
Okay. So now on to the possible policy topics. So there's just a big picture of all of them. And as Steve said, tried to break these up a little bit into the policy briefings being the ones that would likely, potentially require up to 3 presentations And then one's based off previous discussions with the board that would be more appropriate as just issue tracking for the board to do, not the policy presentations, but items that could be updated through the updates that Steve gives to the board, the administrative updates at the end of the board meetings. So now get into each of these individually. So the first one is part-time firefighter employment. Previously, we had called this one concurrent employment, I believe. And so this came to the board from, gosh, Steve, can help me out with this one. Was it how did we get this
It
one?
was member correspondence from last year. There was a member who was working full-time for one employer, part-time for another employer, and was wondering why his salary for the part-time employment wasn't included in his pension.
Yeah, and so the more we started to discuss this issue, we realized that it went beyond just that and into, what happens to an individual who is working as a part-time firefighter if they are injured to the point of where they would normally, in a left position, qualify for disability or duty death benefits. What would their coverage be? Is that the appropriate coverage for those benefits? And so the second bullet point here, and we're going to repeat this throughout all of these policy slides of the issue, and then what we're calling status motion. So just to let you know what we see based off the previous discussions with the board of what this may require workload-wise for the interim. And so this one would be an educational briefing presentation on real big picture membership requirements, disability death benefits, the differences between LEF, PERS, the Board of Volunteer Firefighters, and reserve law enforcement officers. So we would, board staff would work with the board and DRS to gather data and information and present that to the board on the differences between all of these plans for part-time firefighter employment. And then it would be after that educational briefing, it could lead to possible policy briefings leading up to legislation. So the typical 3 presentation process for the board. So if there's any questions on this topic, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Just real quick, I mean, we don't have a date set for the briefing or?
No, we did not develop a calendar.
Okay.
Plan was to wait till after this and then develop a calendar of
We're going to pick and choose.
Yeah, how
So
we
this
were
is just
gonna-
one of the many policies. and the
yes,
Workload that's going to be put on you on what we want to see and what we don't want to see, correct?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Senator.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not often anymore we come up with something that is a novel concept. We've moved from we don't know to now we know what we don't know. And it seems like this is going to the, from the very beginning before we actually had any marquee benefit improvements was the safety and welfare of people that were injured in the course of duty. I'm curious about this enough. I'd like to see this move forward and see a full briefing on this. Just as the novel idea is that you have somebody that's a full-time SEDAR-LEP member, yet they have additional employment elsewhere, and why would they actually have, a differential coverage doing the same job for two different employers out there? I'm kind of lost with this. I'd sure like to have this developed a little bit for the board.
Pat?
Ooh, yeah, I understand where we're trying to go with this. This is, I'm not sure how I need to approach this. We dealt with something like this 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And it becomes an issue on, first of all, so an employer hires a part-time firefighter and they don't have to pay contributions on them. They don't cover them on insurance. So the employer that's hired a part-time employee is getting a cut rate pay for somebody from a city or a district that's got a full-time firefighter. Now, I understand everybody likes to make money and, do what they're going to do. But sometimes we have to be rational and deal with saying, if you want to be a firefighter full-time. Don't go over here and do it part-time. Because the requirements, especially with one of the things is that, the amount of training and training and education you have to be either a police officer or a firefighter is mandated by in rules and regulations. And if all of a sudden this firefighter gets hurt in the part-time, there's going to be an argument and a fight over whose insurance is going to pay for it, what's going to happen with disability, and some of these other issues. And I like what Senator Holy says is that we probably need to have a class in this, but it wasn't a good idea 25 years ago, and I'm still not convinced it's a good idea now. And I'm being very biased in my opinion right now. It'd be hard for me to be adjusted because it is costing somebody something down the road and somebody's saving money on the side, and they're not really seeing the value of the firefighter if they don't want to hire a full-time firefighter. It's not that they can't, they just won't most of the time. And they'll use cost analysis to say we can't afford it, blah, blah, blah. Or in reality, then they shouldn't have a part-time guy there either because it's creating a problem. So I didn't want to get into it, but I did. And I just want to make it very clear that sometimes we all have part-time jobs, and just because it's a part-time job, it's the same as my full-time job. Because what happens if that part-time firefighter becomes a part-time lieutenant or officer into that group? Now they've got different responsibilities. And if all of a sudden he does something over there that creates a problem, is that going to come back on his full-time job? Or he may be a firefighter only. And because of what he did over in the part-time, it may be disciplinary for him at his full-time job. So there's a lot of issues that can come up in this situation that could adversely impact both the employer and the employee down the road. So that's my little soapbox.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
So under the topic of we didn't know what we didn't know, now we know what we don't know. You know what you know. I'm saying this is not a novel idea to you. This is something that's catching me totally unaware on that. And if we have a briefing on this, odds are 50-50. We all might end up having the same opinion you do, walking away from it there and arrive at the same conclusion. But I'd sure like to have that briefing, so at least I could catch up to where you're at.
Yeah.
So is that a motion to move it forward?
Well, I moved, yes.
Thank you. Is there a second? Motion is made and seconded to continue the educational briefing presentations on membership requirements for part-time firefighter employment. Discussion. Seeing none, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just looking at this list, I want to get a kind of a sense of how much capacity we actually have before we get too far down one at a time, deciding we like each thing or not.
The first slide that Jacob had up there had like 8 different topics. All you're committing to or committing us to today would be the first briefing on each of those 8. And then they would, after you get the first briefing, there'll be a decision at that point in time about whether you want to follow up. We're confident that if you decided to do all 8 of those, we've got the capacity to do the first briefings on all of it, the 8. In fact, you'll find we snuck in the first briefing on one of them already, just in case you decided to move it forward. We could kind of get a little bit of a jump on the workload. And if you didn't, it'll be educational anyway. But if you decided to move all 8 of them forward to legislation, and that was 24 briefings over the course of the interim. That would be more challenging. Jacob's got super high capacity, and Tim's done this job before. Karen can do it. I've done this before, so we can help out if it came to that. But at the same time, I don't know that you want to do 8 bills. So the sooner you can kind of screen out an issue and say, we've got enough, we wanted some information on this. Don't know that we necessarily want a bill on this, though. We've got the information. We can let it go now. As soon as you reach a comfort point, and the comfort point may be you guys fighting in December over 8 different bill topics. If it comes to that, we could handle it. But to the extent that you decide, in these other issues are more important, maybe something slides to next year and we don't need to do it all this year, or that's where we'll manage the workload. But we can get you the first 8 on all of these for sure, if that's what you want.
Jacob, number 2.
Okay, on to number 2 here. So reserve police officer service credit. And so prior to 2024, part-time law enforcement officers earned service credit in the Volunteer Firefighters and Reserve Officers Relief and Pension Fund. Since that just passed last session, allowing for part-time law enforcement officers, this question came to the board from Senator Lovick, sent correspondence to the board, which I believe is in your materials, requesting that you look into this. And so the issue would be, or the request was, whether they should have the option, these law enforcement officers who are now eligible for LEF, whether they should have the option to purchase their past part-time or their past service credit into LEF 2 from the Volunteer Reserve Officers Fund. And so the status on this one would be, in motion would be for an educational briefing presentation on membership requirements and different benefits for the Volunteer Firefighters and Reserve Officer Fund, and then possible policy briefings for legislation.
Right, item number 2 is before you. Is there a direction?
Mr. Chair. So this one, it's like partially in the same lane as the last one.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, conceptually, maybe if I'm anywhere near convincing, we did move forward at least with a briefing that Steve, is there any way these can be combined or at least have some sort of an overlap there, because it seems like there's some common material.
Yeah, Jacob and I we had the idea of bringing these 2 topics up side by side because we also saw that there was some significant overlap.
Yeah, I've Senator Lovick, is a county sheriff, not a deputy sheriff, was a county sheriff. He's a retired state patrol. I mean, the guy's been an admin. He gets, away from the bottom, sees a Mustang. I mean, he sees both sides of the equation. He's fairly straightforward about things that are right or wrong on this, that appear to be. And my point is I believe, having worked with him on pieces of legislation, I mean, brought you, and we've tried to make things at least have a reality check, before they're brought forward. I think if we don't at least have a briefing and develop this just a little bit, at least have some judicial notice with the board. He has a tendency, he'll just run legislation anyway on these issues that he thinks correct. So it probably is not a bad idea for us to get up to speed. So something like this does come, we've got a fingerprint on it versus not, just one man's opinion.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's also a drastic difference between what a reserve officer was. I'm not sure there's more right now that is. A lot of the reserve programs have gone away. And then the new statute, what a part-time officer is also very different from what a reserve was or is. So I think some exploration moving forward with, because you've kind of got this hydra, right? Of a full-time, a part-time, and a reserve, and they're all very, very different. And what qualifies, as a left to employee based upon what their status is as a police officer, are they sworn and not sworn, is it commissioned, partially commissioned? There's so many different lanes that you can go into. And then to try to say, okay, which one falls within a left to benefit is a little murky at this point. So I think further exploration would be warranted. So did you make a motion?
You do, and I'll
All
second.
right, I'll make a motion to move it forward.
Second.
Motion is made and seconded and move item number 2 forward. Further discussion? Comments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Jacob.
Opposed? All right, motion passes.
Okay. On to number 3, duty disability health insurance. And so this came to the board. There was a letter from the WACOPS organization requesting the board study this issue. The issue was regarding members who are recovering from a duty-related injury, having their access to and cost of health insurance change as their employment and retirement status changes. I should go ahead and just say this is the one that is on the agenda after for an educational briefing is on the agenda as the next item. So yeah, I go into more detail about it at that time. But yeah, it came from a specific situation regarding a member who was injured, was recovering, was going to lose their employment after a certain period of time and their protections had lapsed. And so we would walk in the educational briefing. I'll walk through the different steps of that process and some of the different options. It gets pretty complicated for members pretty quickly. And so the status in this one would be an educational briefing and then possible policy briefings after that if the board would like.
Jacob, I know it's scheduled. I mean, you're going to do it here in a few minutes. Do we just move forward then? Or, I mean, how do you want to handle this, Steve?
We need a
Well,
vote.
no, yeah, theoretically, yeah,
If we said no, though, would we not have the
you'd
president?
still have the education briefing. You just wouldn't have a question at the end of
Okay,
the education briefing about whether you want to move it forward or not.
Got it. So item number 3 is before us.
I make a motion.
Motion's been made and seconded to move item number 3 forward. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Item number 3 is adopted. Number 4.
Okay, number 4, standby pay. So this is an issue the board has studied in the past. So standby pay is not considered basic salary in left to, even though the member may have several requirements to meet to qualify for standby pay. And so what we mean by that is that to be considered basic salary, it would have to be considered service pay for services rendered. And DRS has determined that is not the case, that it's being paid pretty much not to work. But it's my understanding that the requirements for left members and probably others as well, but for left members has the requirements to be on standby pay have grown as far as that you're not just making a quick phone call in and that's it, that there are additional requirements that have to be met to receive that standby pay. And so the question was whether that the issue of whether it should be basic salary or not should be reconsidered. So the status motion on this one would be policy briefings, potentially 3 leading to possible legislation. So any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And I should add, this one came from, I believe, AJ. So
Questions or comments? Direction? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to see this one move forward for a briefing, although I can understand the argument on both sides. I could argue that there is a service being provided when you're on standby. You're not allowed to leave, and your time is not your own. So you're committed to the organization for the period of time you're on standby, and I believe that's a service rendered. So we could have more of that conversation later, but just for that reason, I'd love to see more conversation on this.
Mr. Chair, question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there certain agencies under CBAs that actually have this included as a topic?
Not where it's not a standby pay is bargained. The inclusion of it as salary for left purposes, that can't be bargained. There was legislation to make standby pay in certain circumstances salary for PERS, and that would be part of what the same issue that Jacob talked about. If the level of personal service, the things that you have to do in order to qualify for standby pay reach an extent that the legislature felt like, yeah, this is some type of service. But that would be Jacob would talk about all of that in the initial briefing.
Thank you. AJ, looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was talking to Steve about this at our educational conference, and he told me that I think it's PERS members have it, and so it just seems like we should too.
Thank you for that overwhelming speech. All right. Daryl.
You get a question. Is it, it seems to me like our agency at one time was counting that. Is this very specifically addressed that it is not accounted for, or it's not?
Yeah, there's a whack on it. And that's one thing that occasionally comes up is a member will retire, and in the course of auditing their account, DRS will find that standby pay was reported and that gets backed out. And their pension gets adjusted accordingly.
I guess for just that matter alone, I would make a motion that we move it forward.
Motion's been made and second to move forward. Item number 4. Is there further discussion? Comments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Number 5.
Okay, so here we have COLA and inflation. So the issue is that recent inflation has greatly exceeded projections, which has created concerns for some retirees about how long it will take for the current COLA to catch up with lost earning power. So we talked about this in previous meetings, and it came up at the beginning, I believe, last year as inflation went up. That while the current process policy for Left 2 and the other Plan 2s to deal with inflation is to have this COLA banking process that caps out the COLA at 3% and then banks the inflation that's over 3% that will then be due to retirees when inflation dips below 3%. But there has been growing concern about how much has banked. And so the thought here was that we would work with the actuaries to study that and then possibly be able to provide a pricing on what it would cost to make changes to that current policy of 3% with COLA banking. So the status motion on this one would be up to 3 policy briefings for possible legislation. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Direction?
I make a motion to move it forward.
Motion's been made and seconded to move it forward. Move item number 5 forward. Discussion? Comments?
Just a quick rabbit trail on this. I talked to Steve earlier. I often get questions from my peers on do I have to work 20 years for a COLA? And if I don't work 20 years for a COLA, you know, if I retired 18, do I get my COLA? And then in my discussions with Steve, I learned that there's, you know, you don't have to do 20 for the COLA, but there's something else, right? I just kind of seemed like a time to bring it up.
Yeah, there is confusion because that 3% increase a year, that the legislature chose that exact same 3% per year for 3 different benefits. And so as a result, all 3 of those benefits sometimes get confused. If you retire, the annual cost of living adjustment that you get to your pension is not based on your service credit. It's not based on whether you had a service retirement or a disability. If you go out on a duty disability at age 40, you're going to get, with 5 years of service, you're going to get a COLA for the rest of your life. If you go out on a service retirement with 10 years or 20 years or more, you're going to get a COLA. There's a different benefit that the legislature passed to recognize those people who might work 20 years, but they started young. Maybe they started when they were 20. They worked 20 years and they stop at 40. They're not going to get their pension until they're 50. And to kind of mitigate the effect of inflation on their pension during those 10 years, if you have 20 years of service, you get this pre-retirement adjustment to your final average salary, which also happens to be 3% a year. So that's where that one kind of sometimes gets confused with the 3% COLA or the 3% early retirement reduction. Some people see that as, oh, every year I work past 50, I'm getting an extra 3% as long as I have 20 years. And they're thinking about the elimination of the early retirement reduction. We do have a plan in the works for a video that we get a fair number of questions about that every year. And we felt like that would be a good topic for a video. It's currently number 2 on the list of future videos. So that'll maybe help answer the question in the future. You'll be able to just point people to that.
And it's just not a catchy name for it, but it's called indexing is what DRS calls it. But yeah, I wish there was a catchier name, but everyone just calls it a COLA because it works like a COLA.
Right. Thank you, Steve.
Do you have a question? Is there a way an individual, maybe this is more towards Sean or DRS, they can see how much they have banked?
No, not yet. That'd be one of the things that we could talk about. Right now, banking is all handled by the actuary, actually, and they send out a letter each year, what they call a COLA letter to DRS, and we put it on the website. But all the letter shows you is based on your retirement date, here's your COLA. And right now, for everybody, it's 3% because so the amount that's banked is unclear, and that would be part of what we would look into if you move this issue, you know, as part of the background on this issue. How much is in the bank is a common question, and we don't have an answer.
Yes, sir, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, just to clarify a little bit, the term used, you know, based on your time of retirement, that there is no aggregate bank out there that everybody draws from. You know, you started ground zero at the time of retirement. Say if it was 15 years ago, you might have had 1% inflation, so you never even have made that 3%. There's zero banking on that. Versus if you started 30 years ago, you know, you'd have had horrendous amounts out there that you'd have drawn down from. I mean, it's because of a moment in time at your retirement that everybody starts. So everybody's unique. It's not something that's an aggregate banking out there.
That's a perfect point. So for instance, inflation has been high, say for the last 3 years. If you retired 5 years ago, you've got banked inflation. If you retired this year, then when you get your COLA next year, it might be 3%, might be a little bit less. Inflation's kind of moderated a bit, but your bank will only be based on that 1 year. And so even if you if there is something in the bank, you might only have 1% or less in the bank, whereas somebody else 3 years ago might have 12% in the bank or whatever. Sean?
Morning, Sean.
Good morning. I'll just do this. I just want to come up, I wasn't planning on speaking on this topic at all, but this is an incredibly complicated issue. And I think when I started hearing about it, I assumed, oh, you save or you get a percentage above, let's say it's 5%, then 2% goes into my bank. What I've learned and the little I'm hearing about it when you talk to the programmers, it's actually each individual has their own calculation, and it's not a percentage, it's actual money, like dollars. What would your benefit increase by? And that's what gets it. So I think it warrants a discussion of how this actually works for all of you to understand it and what it means. And also the 3% that Steve references for Plan 3, indexing is Plan 3. The Plan 2s don't have indexing. After 20 years, I don't get, like, if I stopped working, I'm not going to get a 3% increase unless I was Plan 3. So that's a feature of the Plans 3 that were created.
So Sean, real
And
quick,
left
I
too.
don't want to go down deep in this
Yeah.
rabbit hole,
Okay.
Yeah.
but I'll use Pat.
Sure.
Yeah. If you were to, let's say you had 3% and CPI was at 5, you got your 3, the 2%, and what you're explaining is that 2% is a dollar value.
That's my understanding when I heard it discussed. I had just assumed you got, hey, you're going to get a 2% sort of thrown into your bank.
Yeah.
What you do is you calculate the COLA. And again, I am not the person to talk about this. This just, I think, illustrates that this is something perhaps that needs a little more like actual people that really understand this to have a discussion. You calculate what my new benefit is going to be based on a 3%. So I have $2,000. What's an increase of 3%? And then what would that increase be with 5? That money gets sort of peeled off and put into my bank, but it's not the percent of the inflation. I guess the programmers got really incensed about, like, it's not a percentage, it's actual dollars. So I think a better understanding of the issue is probably not a bad idea.
I think it's a great idea because in just public school math would
Right.
this would show that the value of what your 2% that you banked is
Right.
far less in the future.
Possibly. That's why, Jacob was talking about speaking actuarial. This is the same sort of thing. Like, speaking out of, it's easy to speak out of turn.
2% now versus 5 years.
Yeah.
Big difference.
Huge.
I never even thought of that though.
Yeah. Me either. So thus we have a motion to move it forward.
Well,
So yeah, I'll second that motion. Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
I can, Mark.
Okay. So if there's been a motion, I'd like to second that because I think it's a really important issue. Being a retired guy myself, and I think that if we need to learn about this issue and see what we can do to, first of all, learn about it, and second of all, if we need to make a change, then we'll have enough information to be able to propose something. So I speak in favor of my own second of the motion.
This item is so important. We've done it twice now. So yeah, we've already handled it. We doubled back. It was a question by Jason that opened up Pandora's box. Thank you, sir. And then we got sidetracked. So we've 5 has been adopted. Is that correct? That's what I understand.
Yes, but the
Right?
discussion is super helpful for us in order to prepare for the briefing that you've already moved and adopted. So
yeah,
this was helpful. So I don't want you to feel like it was a waste of time. The more discussion you have, I said it earlier, the more discussion you have, the more it helps us prepare for that.
Well, I'm waiting on us to vote it down one time. Now.
That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
But
So we are clear. We had a motion made and it's been adopted. I want to make sure we're good to go. So, okay. Item 5 is adopted.
Okay.
All right. Number 6. Write down the motion.
Okay, authorized leave of absence, service credit purchase at retirement. And as long as that title is, it still doesn't capture exactly how complicated this issue is to narrow down. So the issue is that members, this came from a study last year where we started off with a different issue, and then the more we dug into it, we kind of zeroed in on this being one of the underlying issues, which was that members retiring immediately after being out on authorized leave of absence are not eligible to purchase service credit for that time. And that's because they need to return to work. And so this came from an issue with the differences between being on temporary non-duty disability versus duty disability, and the buyback provisions that are in some collective bargaining agreements. Which I won't get into all of that now, but just as a reminder of what the discussion was last interim. And then at the end of last interim, instead of moving forward with this, decided it needed to be considered again this interim. Needed to be, if it was going to move forward, it needed to be worked on some more. So this motion in front of the board and status of this would be policy briefings, up to 3 of those briefings for possible legislation. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Correction? Motion is made to move forward. Is there a second? Motion is made and seconded. Discussion? Seeing none, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Number 6 is adopted.
Okay. On to number 7, salary setting responsibility. So this is the one that I talked about earlier that was previously presented to or on the list for the board as an administrative topic, but decided that there was a little more complexity to it and it was more appropriate to be added as a policy topic. And so the issue is that the board endorsed legislation that included authority for the board to set salaries for certain board staff. And to be fair, the board endorsed legislation that allowed it to be set for all staff, but that was amended during session down to the policy positions. And so the status motion of this would be for the board to receive a briefing on the legislation, and then would need to develop an implementation plan. So there's some language in the law that was passed that would need to be discussed about how the board would like to move forward with that, with meeting the requirements of that legislation. If there's any questions on this, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Correction?
Motion to move forward.
So, yep, I'll second that motion. I think this is a super important thing and something that we've been working on for a long time. I think it's critical that we move forward with it. So I'm in favor. Discussion.
Other comments? Hearing none. On the motion to move 7 forward, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? 7 is adopted. Item number 8.
Okay, DRS appeals deadlines. And so this was another one that carried over from last interim. The issue was that a couple left 2 members, or at least a couple, had expressed concerns regarding a lack of clarity on the deadline for administrative appeals with DRS, particularly when the member was required to provide additional information to DRS. And then there was unclear communication about what the deadline for filing that appeal was. And so the status and motion of this would be, if the board did move forward on it, it would be policy briefings, potentially up to 3, to sponsor legislation. And then there had been some discussion, though I have the different status motion here because there had been some discussion by the board of whether to defer this issue. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. the couple of members that were impacted by this, the issues have been partially resolved by legislative staff. And quite frankly, we have an election cycle coming up in front of us here. We're going to have a new governor, which means we're going to have all new agency heads appointed, assuming that happening. We've got we're standing on sand right now with any decision we make as to things that potentially could have been resolved by policy changes within an agency. So I'm going to ask that we defer this at least to the next interim here till we find out exactly who's in office, who the players are, and what we have to deal with.
I'll second that motion.
So, yeah, discussion. So it's really, so motion's been made and seconded to not move it forward, just to kind of evaluate. We'll see what takes place. Further discussion? Representative Berquist, were you going to say something? Okay. Other comments? Seeing or hearing none. All those in favor of not moving number 8 forward, say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, number 8 is, I want to say rejected. It's not the right word, but it's deferred. Yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, just, do we need to have a separate motion to have it stay as part of the next interim, or staff just writing that down and taking that in?
Yeah. As I understood the motion for deferral, this would be something that we would come back to with you next year as part of the draft work plan.
Perfect. Jacob.
Okay, so just a reminder of that initial slide that I showed the board of the, we had the policy briefing topics and then the issue tracking topics. So now we're on to those issue tracking topics. And so this one is month of death, which the board has discussed multiple in terms. And so just as a reminder, in the month the retiree or survivor passes away, the last month benefit payment is prorated based on the number of days that person was alive in the month. And this can often result in an overpayment being made and an invoice being sent to the family or estate to collect on that overpayment. And so there's been legislation proposed in the past, including last session, to pay the full month of final month instead of prorating it. That legislation has not been successful. And so the board had discussed tracking this issue and keeping and having board staff keep you apprised of any action taken by the Select Committee on Pension Policy or by the Department of Retirement Systems. From what me and Steve have in our meetings with DRS have heard is that they do not plan on doing governor request legislation or requesting the Left 2 board or Select Committee to endorse legislation this coming session. And then also I've presented in front of the Select Committee in the last couple months, and it sounds like they are not planning on studying this issue again this interim. So if there's any questions about it, I'd be
The SCPP is undecided at this point in time. I think it's probably the most accurate way to describe their position. Sean?
I believe in the executive session, they are going to have a briefing in June on the issue.
okay.
All right, so before us is to keep the board apprised of any action taken by SCPP or DRS.
Mr. Chair, I make a motion to follow the lead from SCPP and DRS.
Is there a second? Motion made and seconded. Discussion? Seeing none, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? 9 is deferred again, but it is. It's just tracking, just watching. Yeah.
Yep.
Number 10.
Okay, number 10, implementation of the 2024 legislation. This would be the implementation of the potentially complex legislation that the board endorsed and that was passed in the 2024 session that we've referred to as the omnibus bill, since the different topics were all combined into one. And so there's a few of these issues were impacting a limited number of individuals, and they were complex. And so the thought here was that the board would receive, that board staff would continue to work with Department of Retirement Systems and in one of these L&I to ensure that the legislation was implemented the way that was intended, and then report back to the board if there were any issues in that process. And then also on not only for the board endorsed bill, but also there was a lot of questions from the board after the passage of the part-time law enforcement officer bill and some unknowns about exactly how that would be used and implemented. And so the board staff would continue to keep an eye on that as well, and continue to communicate with Department of Retirement Systems on the implementation of that. And then the status motion would be for the board to track that issue and for staff to keep the board informed on how that's going. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Patrick?
Chair, I'd move to keep, I'd make a motion to have the board kept informed on the implementation of these bills.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion made and seconded to continue tracking, keep the board informed as it moves forward. Further discussion? Sorry, go ahead.
I suspect this is going to be part of moving forward, but on the part-time law enforcement officer bill, as I read it, it appears that if you were to be employed as a part-time police officer, again, not a reserve, not a volunteer, you would fall under left 2.
Yes.
Working for a left 2 employer. Nothing really would change other than you're not a quote unquote FTE or full-time employment position. You're going to be some percentage. The question that was posed to me is, and again, this is for the sake of discussion, is what percentage of an employee are you? And is that based, what the assumption that I'm making is like how many hours you work, and what that would look like. That would be something that I think is pertinent to come up with.
The question about, like, from a HR standpoint, say you're working half-time, then you might be a half of an employee. In the state, that would be half of an FTE or full-time employee. The pension statutes work a little bit differently. And so you get full service credit if you work 90 or more hours. 90 hours is generally not full-time employment, but you get a full service credit. You get half service credit if you work 70 hours. And then you get a quarter month of service credit if you work any hours. So the way it plays out pension wise is very different than the way it might play out HR wise. But if there was interest in a educational briefing on the pension impacts of part-time members, we could do something like that and go into some of these types of questions a little bit more differently. For instance, one of the unintended consequences, say you were working half-time and you're getting half pay, you might end up with, actually, instead of half of your pension benefit after 10 years, you might actually end up with a quarter of your pension benefit, because now the way the formula works, it's a half of a half. So I don't know if, for instance, that was really well thought out. But those would be the kind of examples that we could kind of walk through if you wanted an educational briefing on that.
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, but also, not to add more work, I think that can be rolled into number 1 and 2.
That's what I was just looking
yeah.
at, whether it would fall under.
Yeah, or specifically in this case for the time, place, that would be number 2.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah, I can
make,
do that.
we'll make sure it does.
I can just see, all of a sudden, there's gonna be part-time officers showing up across the state, and then we're gonna have all these questions. So if we get ahead of it, I think it'd be prudent.
Patrick.
So, I mean, this goes right back to what Jason said and Senator Holy brought forward with the first issue. So, and I keep on going back to this, is that, so if law enforcement officers can work part-time, why can't firefighters work part-time? And then we're saying, well, they get left 2 credits. And so that means you got a full-time firefighter working half-time on their days off. So instead of getting 1 full credit, they get 1.5 credits per month. And those are the questions that are going to have to be asked and answered when we come up on this, because that is a situation. That's a huge situation.
Yeah, when we talk about that, for instance, on the part-time firefighter issue, one of the things that comes up, the way it works right now, if you're not full-time,
Yes.
but then you might be eligible for PERS. You're not eligible for left, but if you work enough hours, you might be eligible for PERS. And if you don't work enough hours to be eligible for PERS, then you're supposed to be in the Board of Volunteer Firefighters plan. And even if you're getting paid for those hours, what we're trying to figure out, like for instance, the one guy, the question came up, okay, this guy's working part-time. Why isn't he being reported in the Board of Volunteer Firefighter plan? Or is he? That's one of the things that by moving this issue forward, we'll get a better handle on what is the issue.
There's I don't want to get back on it again, but there's a huge amount of issues that can come up when you have somebody that is being offered employment someplace else.
Yeah.
And they're not coming in as a firefighter. I can only address what comes in from the firefighters. A firefighter may, just because we call them a part-time firefighter, they could be hired as a part-time captain or something like that has ultimate authority over people in that department.
Right. And that
creates a problem.
Yes. And that was, as it turned out, the more we looked into that one little question, we found that there were so many other questions, but including like wildland firefighting. You've got during that term, you might have people that are working for one fire department, volunteering for another. Crews are getting sent to fight wildfires. Employers are bringing in part-time people to kind of backfill, and somebody might be working part-time for several different departments during that particular season. We think of part-time as somebody working extensively, but just not working a full week. But DRS calls it temporary. They might be working full-time, but they might just be working for 4 months. And so that's another one of the issues that came up. We'll get into all of that, all these different kind of spins on what that initial question were. We'll get into that on that topic. And as far as going back to your point, Jason, I think working in the impacts of part-time employment period, but in particular the part-time law enforcement, how that would apply to their pension, we'll figure out a way to get that covered under 1 or 2 without a separate educational briefing.
Other questions on the motion?
Mr. Chair, let me just confuse things further. So, and this comes under the category of, I can't remember what I had for dinner last night, and I'm going to use Catholic school math, not public school math here. But Pat, I mean, you brought up a huge issue in front of me here. I'm quickly doing counting my toes and fingers. If you made 100,000 years as a firefighter and you were 50,000 overtime, you'd have X amount of benefits, at a 1% vesting. If you worked for another agency you're talking about, you'd add to the vesting along with the dollar amount on that.
So I mean, quite frankly, it should be to the point where you actually have a dollar amount in contributions equals a dollar amount in benefits for a vesting period out there. I'm going to be watching for that additional vesting, percentage of vesting, that doesn't happen above 1%, above the full-time employee percent, and everything else is considered overtime above and beyond that. So you don't have, we've tried to avoid over a number of years here, differential benefits. Just a thought. So I'm following what you're saying.
Good, because sometimes I lost myself.
All right, other comments or questions on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the continuation of moving this forward through tracking, say aye.
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 Opposed? Tense adopted.
Okay, last one, holiday payments. So this was another issue that carried over from last interim. The current administrative interpretation of when holiday pay is considered earnable compensation is found in an employer notice rather than in rule in WAC. And so the board had made a request to DRS during a meeting last year, and DRS agreed that they would put this into rule. And so we've been working with them on that and following that process. It's not complete yet, but it is in the rulemaking process. And so board staff would continue to update the board on that. And if there are any changes in DRS's plans to put that into rule, we would update the board and then possibly move forward with policy options. So any questions on that one?
Discussion on number 11, direction.
I have a question on that. This is Mark Johnston. And
Mark.
I'm wondering, what's the difference? Is there a legal difference or is there a substantive difference, or how does it work between an employer notice rather than a administrative code rule? I mean, does it put more, does a WAC have more authority than an employer notice, or are the
Yes.
employers, okay, yep, sorry.
Yeah, so now a WAC, if it's put into administrative code, there's actually a process for hearings and public input, and there's a judicial presumption, for instance, that after a WAC has been published and available for a period of time, that it's considered that the legislature is aware of it and acquiesces in it. So there are some legal weight impact to WAC. The employer notice is binding on the way the employer reports it, but the process is there are no hearings, there are no publication in the state register or any of those kind of things that you would see for a WAC. It exists out on the DRS website, and DRS could change that employer notice at any time.
Okay, so there's no, it would be easy to violate an employer notice without sanctions versus a administrative code? Is that?
The sanctions, for lack of a word, would be different. The consequences of violating an employer notice are different than the consequences of violating a WAC.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you. Yep.
Other questions? Direction?
Mr. Chair, does this even take board action to have this happen?
What we were, the piece that maybe is, are you okay with letting DRS go first? Or last year you were considering potential legislation, and then the request was DRS was going to do it in WAC. Are you okay waiting to kind of see what their WAC is before you do anything on this topic?
So that would be the motion then? I know
Yeah.
you're looking for it, so yeah.
So moved.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second.
Second to continue monitoring, I guess, right?
Correct.
Further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed? Item 11 is adopted to move forward.
Okay, and that is everything. Thank you.
Nice job.
Yeah.
And number 3 on the, or number 4, sorry, on the list is the duty disability health insurance annual briefing. Jacob, still there.
Okay. Yeah, Microsoft updated everything and it's made it nothing easier to use here. So let me.
They got a fix you can buy for 60 days.
So I'll jump in with a intro. And by the way, I don't know if in the onboarding, I think maybe the purpose of the intros was given to you or not, but in the past, not every board member can make it to every meeting, and occasionally they'll come to a meeting and there'll be something on the agenda, and there were questions about how did this end up on the agenda? And so the purpose of the introduction is to answer that question before you ever have to ask it, is to remind you of where this came from, because the answer is the same always. It came from you guys. So that to the extent that there's ever any concern or question that items are ending up on the agenda by other than board action, this is intended to kind of address that. But
Are you saying that we can't blame anybody but ourselves?
yeah, it's actually, I am saying that because the only other choice would be to blame me. Yes, but, so earlier, Jacob mentioned the topic of the WACOPS correspondence. And in discussing that, we were trying to figure out planning for the interim. We had the idea that that's actually a real good topic for an educational briefing. And you guys had asked for an educational briefing at the last meeting, although it wasn't maybe in the form of a motion. So we put it on here with the idea that if you adopted it for the interim plan, as you did, we could jump right into it. So this is a response to a beginning of a response to the WACOPS correspondence, and it's just here's how things work today.
Yeah.
With that, Jacob, now that Microsoft is done updating, I'll let you get to it.
Okay. Yeah, once again, for the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. So just a reminder of what this issue was, since it was a few issues back on the last presentation. Members recovering from a duty-related injury have their access to and cost of health insurance change as their employment and retirement status changes. This is, an attempt to try to help you get your hands around this complex issue. I will say, just based off some of the conversations prior to today's board meeting, it gets very complex, and there's a lot of different paths that people can end up on when they're going through this. So this does not address everything, but try to at least give you kind of a big picture view of some of the issues that occur for members going through duty-related injuries and on their journey to try to return to work. So the possible steps for a disabled left 2 member that's injured at work and unable to return immediately to duty is that they would be on temporary duty disability. And even that, so I'm default to pension terms, and there are some different terms for L&I and that I hear members use. But I'll be, can't help but default to the pension terms. So temporary duty disability, when you are injured at work, and our plan is that you will be able to hopefully return. After temporary duty disability, there is duty disability retirement, authorized leave of absence, or in some instances, employer may terminate the employment of the member if they're not able to. So this is after temporary duty disability has lapsed and you are still unable to return to work. These are three of the options. I'm going to go into more detail about all of this. And it really was that employer being able to terminate employment at this point that was the concern raised leading to this presentation, or at least part of the concern. And then in some instances, members able to recover and return to left employment, and that may occur after that temporary duty disability stage has ended. They could return later, and I'll go through some of the options with that. So temporary duty disability involves L&I benefits. Wage replacement is the main benefit. This is not designed to fully replace a member's wage. Members also may qualify for light duty if that's something the employer can accommodate, and members or employees are required by L&I law to take that light duty if they're cleared by their doctor to do so. If they don't take it, then they no longer qualify for that L&I wage replacement benefit. But the employer is not required to offer light duty. Obviously, as you can imagine, would depend on the size of the employer and the jobs they have available. And if they do take light duty and that is part-time, doesn't pay near what they were making before, then there is a separate L&I benefit called a loss of earning power benefit that helps make up some of that difference. And while someone is receiving these benefits, they qualify for medical care related to their duty-related injury. That would be covered. And then for this time period that they're out, this would be considered temporary duty disability by under Left 2 law. And as I touched on with a previous topic on the last presentation, they would be able to purchase service credit from that temporary duty disability. And then there is a separate benefit that I'm going to go in more detail in the next slide that is called the disability leave supplement benefit. And this is not, I just want to be clear, this is not paid out of the Left 2 pension system. So under this benefit, the employee must receive the base salary that they would have received before the injury. It's the difference between, so they would still be qualifying for that L&I benefit. And so the supplement is for the difference between their L&I benefit and that base salary benefit. Half that amount is charged against the employee's accrued paid leave, and half is paid by the employer. If the employee doesn't have any accrued leave, then they just don't receive that portion of the money. They still would receive the half that the employer pays, but the employer doesn't have to, pay the rest. Employer health insurance coverage is still provided when someone is out on disability leave supplement. And this law requires it for a maximum of 6 months of disability leave supplement coverage. However, and this is one of the issues that came up in the letter from WACOPS, was that while there's a maximum of 6 months under the law, employers may offer additional coverage outside of this law, and this is typically bargained for between the employees and the employer. And so there's been some confusion about why some employers were, some employees were getting more coverage than others.
So I'm sorry, Jacob, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So do these rules apply to employers that are in the state fund and also self-insured?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so after temporary duty disability, and really this is not probably a better title here would have been after that disability leave supplement benefit. So after that has lapsed, whether it's 6 months or longer, what happens if the member is unable to return to work, if they are still injured and they are still recovering? So they could be out on authorized leave of absence, but as that title implies, it needs to be authorized. So that is really up to the employer's discretion whether they are allowed to remain employed and out on leave as authorized leave of absence. One of the other options would be the employer could terminate the employee after that time that they're unable to return to their work. They've exhausted that temporary coverage, disability leave supplement coverage. And so the employer may be able to do that. Or the member could go out on a duty disability retirement. So often when we think of disability retirement, we think of that being permanent, that someone goes out on that and they're not planning on returning to work. But employees can actually use the disability retirement, qualify for it, and once they are recovered, return to work. So I'm going to touch more on that here on this next slide. So when someone is out on duty disability, and I'll touch on both duty and catastrophic disability, the two types of duty disability benefit. And I think duty disability would likely be the option that would occur more frequently in this type of situation we're discussing. But so someone out on that benefit would begin receiving their disability benefit. They would no longer receive health insurance from their employer, and there is no health insurance coverage paid by LEF2 for duty disability retirees. But at least the member would start receiving their pension benefit, which could help them pay for health insurance. They would be eligible for COBRA health insurance coverage. COBRA typically lasts for 18 months, but in certain situations can be extended up to 29 or 36 months. And then catastrophic disability, for this, LEF2 does reimburse for premiums paid for employer-provided health insurance, COBRA, and Medicare Part A and B. But like I said, I think it's more realistic that someone would likely in a temporary duty situation where they are planning to return to work, would more likely fall under the duty disability, meaning that they could, while they could not do LEF2 employment for that time period, they would possibly still be able to do other types of employment, where catastrophic would require that they are not able to return to work in any capacity. So what happens when a member goes, in this situation, would go out on duty disability? They continue to rehab, they recover, and they believe they are now able to return to duty. The employer at this point is required to rehire the member. So this would be one way. When I talked earlier about the employer, after the leave supplement benefit has lapsed, and they would have that ability to terminate the employee, that the employee could go out on duty disability retirement, continue to recover, and then the employer would be required to rehire them. I will say I know there's been a couple issues just in my time working in pensions where employers have disagreed with the member about whether they are actually able to return to duty or not. And I can't recall specifics of how exactly those were resolved, but just that I know there was concern in the past that, well, what happens to the member's disability retirement if they tell DRS, I'm no longer duty disabled, but my employer says I am. Am I caught in a catch-22 where DRS stops my benefit and my employer won't hire me back? And no, DRS in those situations has continued to pay the duty disability retirement benefit while the issue with the employer is resolved.
Jacob?
Yeah.
can a person, and I know the light duty piece of it, if an individual is offered light duty, they're not able to do it, they go through their time frame and then they separate employment. Once they're to a point they can return, does that also mean for like light duty? So let's say you're gone for a year and all of a sudden you're well enough to go back to light duty, but you're not well enough to go back full time. Can you go back to light duty?
So I'm not aware of a situation like that I was involved in, but I can say that just the definition of duty disability requires that you be recovered enough to return to duty, that it would be a left to position.
Thank you. Makes sense.
So if the employee and the employer disagree on that, how does that ultimately get resolved? Is there a hearing? Is there a third party? Does L&I determine that, or how does that work?
Yeah. So I can say when I was legal director of DRS, not by DRS. That was it was between the employer and the member and the union. And I don't know if anyone else has experience with that, but I just cannot recall specifically how it was resolved. I just know in the one instance of it that I was involved in that it did get resolved and the member was able to return to work.
Yeah.
Patrick?
Back when I was legal director at DRS, we had one instance and Mark, the court ended up deciding.
Okay.
So the employee has to sue the employer because they want to.
Well, in the event that there is a disagreement about whether the member is recovered or not, yeah, it could come to that where a court has to make the final decision about whether the person actually is recovered enough to be able to return to duty.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, just checking that really was the end. Yeah, so no action required today. The board, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but the motion earlier was that the board would move forward with policy briefings on this. So this will just serve as an initial presentation. We'll do continued study of this and present again to the board on the issue.
Any questions for Jacob on this?
Save for later.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nelson, item number 5 is your administrative update.
All right.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Thank all of you that you got through a lot, and we appreciate it. I think this sets up the interim well for the team. On the admin briefing, last month, Tim distributed to you corrections to or adjustments, I should say, to the left to budget that were made by the legislature for your adoption, and you did adopt them. At that time, we didn't really have the whole quarterly budget, though, so we've had that distributed to you. If you had any questions about the quarterly budget, I'd be happy to answer those. And if you would prefer to have those questions answered in private, we can do that as well. But I did want to mention that the adjustments by OFM, they subsequently sent out a correction to those adjustments. It doesn't require any further board action, but there was a small reduction in the amount of the consolidated services, $2,000 that they had over calculated. So the budget that was adopted will be adjusted accordingly. WACOPS recently had their outreach. WACOPS recently had their spring meeting, and we had a table there. Jacob did a presentation on what the board was working on. Tammy and Jessica were there representing the Ombudsman program, and Tammy was asked to do a little explanation of the Ombudsman program, got called up for a spot presentation and did well. And then the Washington Association of Police Chiefs, WASPC, they had their conference, and we had an outreach table there where both Tammy and Jessica attended that as well, again, to answer questions about the ombudsman program and so forth. Upcoming outreach, the State Council of Firefighters has their conference, annual conference at the end of June. We will have a table there to answer questions. Not scheduled to give any presentations or anything like that, but we'll have a table manned the entire time. NC PERS, as far as fiduciary education, NC PERS just recently had their conference in Seattle, and that was a good conference. It's the first one I've gone to since before, since COVID. There were some good presentations. There's some stuff Tim and I will maybe bring back to you a little bit later, not today, but ideas for your strategic planning meeting in October. AJ was there, Daryl was there, and Tim and I were there. And then the next meeting. So just to give you guys kind of a heads up, a reminder, the next meeting is on an unusual date. The normal date conflicted with the state firefighters conference. And so we wouldn't have had a quorum if we had the meeting on. So you voted to change the date, and the date is on a Monday instead of a Wednesday. That's because the Wednesday is now a state holiday. So your next meeting is on an unusual date. I don't think you've ever had a board meeting on a Monday before, but your next meeting is Monday, June 17th. And we'll take back the plan that you adopted today, figure out which of those topics. There's some actuarial topics that we know you'll be covering as part of rate setting for June and July. That'll kind of be your primary focus, but we'll try to cover some of those initial briefings on the policy topics as well. And you'll have that agenda in advance of the meeting, but it's because of the date, it's coming up quicker than usual. With that, that concludes my administrative update.
As far as I know, no public comments received. Is that correct?
Well, we did have the public comment from Senator Lovick.
Correct. Yeah.
So and that was distributed to all of you and was incorporated in the work plan. There was no other public comment.
Any other action for the group? Entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion made and seconded to adjourn. Yeah. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you very much. We will see everybody on 17th.